Jasmine Crockett needed only 17 minutes to leave the city's most influential judge visibly shaken, a judge who once ruled unchallenged. In a courtroom clouded by discrimination, silence, and a staggering $15,000 fine, Jasmine didn't just resist. She flipped the entire system on its head. But what truly left everyone stunned was the one question that forced the judge to consider stepping down. It started as an ordinary morning in Chicago. The streets buzzed with honking cars, and towering buildings rose under a gray, indifferent sky. Nobody could have predicted that this very city, where countless quiet struggles and hard-won victories had unfolded, was about to host another clash between power and justice. In a high-rise downtown, Jasmine Crockett, one of the city's most respected and sharp-minded attorneys, began her day like any other. Known for her impressive legal track record and firm commitment to justice, Jasmine had become a force to be reckoned with in courtrooms. She had tackled some of the toughest cases with poise and determination. But today would be different. It began with something seemingly insignificant. A routine summons. A minor administrative violation that shouldn't have raised any red flags. But the language in the notice was oddly worded, strange enough to set her on edge. Jasmine's instincts, honed over years in the legal system, told her something wasn't right. This didn't look like a typical citation, and it didn't feel like a simple mistake. She had always known how the system could move like a faceless machine, directed by forces no one sees. But this time, it wasn't targeting the vulnerable. This time, it was coming for her. The advocate, who had always defended the rights of others, was now being drawn into a trap of her own. Though she could predict the legal path this case would likely take, the way it was presented felt off, unsettling in a way she couldn't shake. The summons was worded to confuse, the process suspiciously quiet. She asked herself, "Why me? Why now?" It felt like she had been pulled into a rigged game without her consent. Jasmine set the summons down on the table, leaned back in her chair, and looked out the window. Morning light poured in, but inside her chest something was tight. Memories flooded her mind. Past cases she had won, people she had stood up for, and the frustration of watching the voiceless get ignored. She had always believed in justice, in fairness. But today, that belief felt tested. Still, she refused to let doubt take over. Jasmine had faced plenty of uphill battles, and this would be no different. She took a steadying breath, grabbed her coat, and prepared to face this challenge head-on. Outside, the air felt denser than usual. The buildings surrounding her seemed to press in closer, and an uneasy tension hung in the wind. As she neared the courthouse, a looming structure that housed the full weight of government power, the environment grew more hostile. It wasn't the usual pre-trial jitters. The marble floors, the echoing footsteps, the silence, it all seemed colder than before. And then she saw him. Judge Richard Monroe. With silver hair and an unforgiving stare, his very presence hushed the room. Everyone's eyes shifted as he entered. Lawyers, clerks, even police officers. The atmosphere tightened. Something was wrong. Jasmine could feel it. Monroe wasted no time. Without explanation or debate, he announced, "Ms. Crockett, you violated an administrative rule. I'm fining you $15,000. It felt like a slap, unexpected, and harsh. Jasmine had been through many legal fights, but this was different. This wasn't justice. This was power being misused, and it was aimed directly at her. Jasmine stepped through the heavy doors of the Chicago Federal Court, where sunlight from high windows streamed in, casting a sterile, almost unnatural glow. This wasn't just a courthouse. It was a monument to authority, a place where justice and injustice often coexisted in ways that were hard to tell apart. But today, it wasn't filled with the usual energy of lawyers and staff. It was disturbingly still, like the calm before a storm. Her footsteps echoed sharply against the stone floors, each one reminding her of the weight she now carried. People in the building turned to look, but there was no warmth in their glances. No recognition of her previous accomplishments. Only silent judgment, as if they didn't expect her to make it through what was ahead. The whispers started almost immediately, low enough to be indecipherable but loud enough to sting. She could feel what they meant. You're not supposed to win this. Still, Jasmine kept walking, her thoughts swirling. The unease inside her felt like something closing in. The building's vast halls seemed to shrink around her, pulling her deeper into a space that didn't feel like justice. It felt like a trap. She approached the courtroom with mixed emotions, part determination, part dread. This wasn't just another legal fight, it was personal. This time she wasn't standing up for someone else. She was defending herself against the very institution she had believed in, and the very people she had once trusted were now willing to turn against her. As she walked the hallways, the silence became more intense. It wasn't just the absence of noise, it was the absence of belief. The courthouse felt more like a machine than a guardian of justice, grinding down those without power. Jasmine had faced this machine before, but never like this. Now, she wasn't fighting alongside the system. She was standing in its way. That weight was real, and it clung to her like a shadow. The legal structure she had spent her life upholding now felt like it was collapsing inward, its mechanisms twisted against her. She paused outside the courtroom, where the hum of discussion and clatter of paperwork was replaced by something far more chilling, complete, unnerving stillness. She took a breath and centered herself. This wasn't just about presenting arguments or defending against a fine. This was about defending her very belief in what the courtroom should stand for. This fight wasn't just legal, it was moral. She had to remind herself who she was. She had spent years fighting for others. Now, she had to fight for herself. The door opened, heads turned. Not with admiration, but with scrutiny. Every glance felt like a test, like she didn't belong. Jasmine walked in, steady and calm, though her heart pounded beneath her composed exterior. She knew this place, she knew its language, but today it felt foreign. Still, she would not allow fear to dictate her next move. The silence that blanketed the courtroom was exactly what the system had come to rely on. A silence where no one dared to speak up. But Jasmine had no intention of staying quiet. As the door closed behind her, she reminded herself she wasn't here to play along with injustice. She was here to challenge it, even if she had to do it alone. The heavy doors of the courtroom had barely shut when Judge Richard Monroe entered, his footsteps echoing ominously through the chamber. Each step seemed calculated, meant to signal control, dominance. His confidence filled the space like a looming storm. This wasn't a judge ready to weigh facts. This was a man who had already decided the outcome before a single word had been spoken. Monroe didn't look at the case files. He didn't acknowledge the attorneys or the courtroom staff. He walked straight to the bench with the air of someone used to absolute power. As he sat, the room shifted. People stiffened. No one dared speak. His presence brought not just order, but fear. Jasmine, steady on the outside, could feel the change. She'd faced formidable judges before, but Monroe was different. He didn't just enforce the law, he manipulated it. His authority wasn't just about rules. It was about control. The way he looked at her, cold, calculated, said everything. He didn't need to raise his voice. His silence alone commanded obedience. Then, in a voice that sliced through the quiet like a blade, he delivered his ruling. Ms. Crockett, based on the report, you're in violation of an administrative rule. The court is fining you $15,000 to be paid immediately. There was no hearing, no defense, just judgment. Jasmine didn't flinch, but inside, the impact was sharp. It wasn't just the fine. It was the disdain with which it was handed down. This wasn't justice. It was humiliation dressed in procedure, a decision made long before she'd even entered the room. Monroe didn't want a discussion. He wanted submission. To him, she wasn't a respected attorney with a record of successful cases. She was just another obstacle to silence. The verdict wasn't about regulation. It was about making a statement. Even someone like Jasmine Crockett wasn't immune to unchecked power, but Jasmine wasn't one to back down. Her face remained calm, though her mind raced. She had faced harder paths before. She wouldn't be crushed by a decision meant to intimidate. As Monroe continued to sit with arms crossed, wearing a smug expression of superiority, Jasmine remained still, unshaken. The silence grew deeper, more oppressive, until Jasmine finally stood. She rose slowly, with the calm of someone who had nothing to fear. There were no theatrics, no dramatic gestures, just quiet strength. The light from above reflected off her polished desk, highlighting her stillness, her resolve. All eyes turned to her. Judges, clerks, even Monroe. Something shifted. Just standing had changed the energy in the room. She was composed, yet every step she took carried weight. There was no rush, no panic. Jasmine was in control of herself, even if the system wasn't on her side. She stopped, met Monroe's stare, then turned to the courtroom, her voice clear and composed. "Does the defendant no longer have the right to be defended?" Her words weren't loud, but they echoed with undeniable force. It wasn't an outburst, it was a demand for accountability. The room froze. Her question landed like a challenge no one expected. The strength in her tone, the conviction in her presence. It made everyone pause. This wasn't just a rhetorical question. It was a strike against a system that had forgotten its own purpose. She had drawn a line. A quiet one, but a line nonetheless. In that moment, it was clear to everyone that Jasmine Crockett was not someone who would allow injustice to pass unchecked. Whether the courtroom stood with her or not, she would not be silent. As Jasmine's question hung in the air, not a soul moved. Not a pen scratched, not a chair creaked. Her words, simple, direct, had shaken the entire room. Everyone from the legal aides to the uniformed officers at the back of the chamber seemed frozen. They had expected resistance, perhaps emotion. But what Jasmine gave them was clarity. A quiet but forceful stand that pierced through their silence like a razor. She didn't plead. She didn't rage. She simply asked the one question that turned the courtroom on its axis. Does the defendant no longer have the right to be defended? It wasn't rhetorical. It was a confrontation with the truth they were all trying to ignore, and it echoed in their minds like a distant thunder. Jasmine didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. Her power came from calm control, from conviction. She wasn't asking for special treatment. She was demanding basic rights. The right to be heard, the right to fairness, the right that every person in that room claimed to believe in. In that moment, she wasn't just speaking for herself. She was speaking for all the forgotten people, the ones dismissed without defense, fined without hearing, silenced without chance. Her question wasn't just for Monroe. It was for everyone who sat silently while justice was bent out of shape by authority. Judge Monroe, still seated high above, leaned back and crossed his arms. His smirk widened, filled with smugness as though he had already won. "Go ahead. Try your best," he said with a condescending tone, "but the result will still be the same." His words were sharp, not in logic but in disdain. Each one meant to remind her who controlled the room, but Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't respond right away. She let the silence grow, let Monroe's arrogance echo off the walls until it became clear that his confidence wasn't strength. It was overcompensation. People in the courtroom exchanged uneasy glances. The mask Monroe wore, that of total control, was beginning to slip. His dismissive tone had revealed more than he intended, fear of being challenged. and Jasmine's stillness in the face of that arrogance began to change the room's energy. She wasn't afraid. She was calculating, waiting. Her silence wasn't submission. It was preparation. Then, when she finally spoke again, it was not to defend herself with emotion or plead her case with desperation. Instead, she began citing the law. Clearly, calmly, like someone who knew exactly where this was headed. She quoted Section 22F, an obscure clause few had memorized, and dissected it precisely. Line by line, she pulled apart the legal foundation Monroe had stood on, exposing its flaws for everyone to see. She wasn't reading a script. She was analyzing, interpreting, striking where it hurt the most. Monroe's sense of superiority. Her words weren't just statements, they were corrections. She pointed to the loopholes in the process, to the legal oversights the court had ignored. She didn't have to scream to be heard. Her mastery of the law spoke louder than anything Monroe could throw at her. For the first time in the hearing, the room leaned toward her, not in pity, but in quiet respect. She had shifted the weight of the argument. Her clarity had cast doubt over Monroe's ruling, and even those who had expected her to falter were now beginning to question everything. Jasmine wasn't just defending herself. She was holding up a mirror to the system, and daring it to face itself. Jasmine's words continued to cut through the courtroom with precision, each one peeling back another layer of false authority. She wasn't lecturing. She was revealing how those in power had bent the law, skipped steps, and ignored the very rules they were meant to uphold. Her voice remained steady, unwavering, a sharp contrast to the rising discomfort spreading across the faces of the opposing attorneys and courtroom staff. She wasn't just arguing a point, she was exposing an entire pattern. With each legal clause she brought up, she laid bare the truth. The prosecution had failed to follow basic legal procedure. Their case rested on nothing more than a few biased interpretations and unverified accusations. No hard evidence, no credible witnesses, just assumption and arrogance. The weight of her argument began to show. The attorneys who once sat with certainty in their posture were now glancing at each other, unsure. They had entered the courtroom thinking this was just another show of power. But now they realized they were in a battle they weren't prepared for, a battle they might not win. Judge Monroe's earlier confidence started to crack. His stare, once sharp and commanding, flickered with something else, uncertainty. His mouth remained firm, but his eyes gave him away. Jasmine wasn't only arguing with him, she was dismantling the foundation of the very verdict he had delivered. Slowly, methodically, she was stripping away the protection of his authority. Even the courtroom itself seemed to respond. The tension in the air thickened, but not from hostility, from anticipation. Her logic had shaken the room. She wasn't shouting for justice, she was showing why it had already been denied, and in doing so she shifted the momentum entirely. When Jasmine pointed out that the very regulation Monroe used to fine her required concrete evidence to be applied, not just subjective judgment, silence swept across the chamber again. This wasn't interpretation. It was fact. It was law. And Monroe had skipped it. The moment felt almost surreal. A courtroom that once dismissed her as an outsider now held its breath at her every word. Her arguments weren't flowery or dramatic. They were clean, efficient, and devastatingly accurate. She was holding the system to its own standards, and it was failing. Monroe, now visibly unsettled, remained silent. The smirk that once accompanied every word had vanished. His posture was unchanged, but his aura was different. For the first time in years, he was being challenged, not by noise, but by truth. Jasmine didn't gloat. She didn't pause to celebrate. She remained calm, grounded, focused. She knew this wasn't over, but she also knew that the courtroom had changed. The people in it had changed. She had forced them to listen, not to her voice, but to the law. they had sworn to uphold, and in that moment the balance of power began to shift. The courtroom, once stiff with tension, was now silent in a different way, not with fear, but with realization. Everyone had heard Jasmine dismantle the prosecution's claims piece by piece. She hadn't just defended herself, she had revealed the hollowness behind their accusations. The lawyers and clerks, once confident in their side, now watched her with a different kind of focus. Uncertain, even a little awed. Judge Monroe could no longer mask his discomfort. His silence, once used to control the room, had become a shield. One that was quickly failing. He was visibly trying to maintain composure, but it was clear to everyone. He hadn't expected this. He thought Jasmine would fold. Instead, she had taken control. With quiet confidence, she moved forward. 3 steps, deliberate and calm, then looked Monroe directly in the eye. Her voice, though composed, carried the weight of someone who had seen this kind of injustice too many times. You are fully aware these procedures were mishandled from the start. If you move forward now, you'll be violating the very rules you're meant to protect. Her words landed like a hammer. The courtroom didn't erupt. They froze. Because what she said was undeniable. There was no defense for it, no angle to twist. Monroe couldn't pretend not to understand what she meant. Jasmine had drawn a legal and ethical line, and Monroe was now standing on the wrong side of it. She gave him no room to maneuver. "Whichever direction you choose," she continued, her tone steady, "you will be exposed. You cannot walk away from this without consequence." That was the final blow. Not loud, not emotional, just truth. And it hit with such force that Monroe visibly tensed, as if cornered. The weight of what she said settled over the room like a dense fog. Even those unfamiliar with legal nuance could feel it. Jasmine had backed him into a position he couldn't escape. The silence returned. But now it was the silence of reckoning. Jasmine didn't gloat or raise her voice. She stood still, her message delivered, her position unshakable. She had said what needed to be said, and she didn't need to say anything more. Monroe's breathing grew heavier, his confidence draining with each second. His body language had changed, still in his chair, but no longer in control. He was a man faced with the truth and without a plan to respond. The courtroom waited. Jasmine's strategy wasn't one of force. It was about logic, law, and patience. She had placed Monroe in a position where every choice now came with damage, to his pride, to his career, or to his credibility. And she had done it with only a few precise sentences. Now, the courtroom didn't see a woman under attack. They saw a force of reason that had silenced one of the most powerful figures in the legal system. With a few words, she had flipped the dynamic. Monroe, once untouchable, now looked like a man trying not to crumble in public, and Jasmine stood firm, silent, strong, and undeniably in control. The courtroom remained locked in a tense silence as the weight of Jasmine's words lingered. Every person present, lawyers, staff, and spectators, felt that something critical had just shifted. For Monroe, the man who once ruled with certainty, there was no immediate response. His expression revealed what he tried to hide: uncertainty, doubt, fear of what had just been laid bare in front of everyone. Then, in a voice lacking its usual strength, Monroe finally spoke. "Court is in recess," he said. But this wasn't a pause to collect paperwork or allow for formalities. This was retreat. A quiet admission that he needed time, not to think through legal matters, but to recover from being cornered so thoroughly. As Monroe stood and exited, whispers surged through the courtroom. No one had to say it aloud. This wasn't a strategic pause. It was a moment of collapse. A man who had built his entire presence on confidence had now been forced to back away under pressure he didn't expect. Jasmine remained where she was, her expression calm, her presence unshaken. She knew that Monroe's silence spoke louder than any ruling. He hadn't regained control. He had lost it. The attorneys nearby exchanged glances. Some whispered quietly. Others simply watched Monroe leave, stunned. Even the court officers didn't move with their usual strictness. Something had cracked. The unshakable had been shaken. And then came a development no one had predicted. When Monroe returned to the courtroom, he wasn't alone. Walking behind him, dressed in the black robe of senior authority, was Judge Thomas Whitaker, a name known across the legal community, respected, feared, and rarely seen in routine proceedings. His presence changed everything. Whitaker didn't say a word as he entered. He didn't need to. His arrival was an unspoken announcement. The stakes had just escalated. This wasn't just about Jasmine and Monroe anymore. It was now a matter for the highest level of the court, a battle not just of one woman against. It a biased ruling, but against the machinery of power itself. Monroe took his seat beside Whitaker, eyes sharp again but voice silent. He wasn't in charge anymore. Now he played support to a higher force. The message was clear. This would not be easy for Jasmine. The system wasn't going to let her win without a final fight, but Jasmine didn't back away. She looked at Whitaker, with a gaze as steady as before. He represented the entire structure of authority, years of precedent, tradition, and influence. But to Jasmine, he was just another barrier between her and justice. A formidable one, yes, but not one she feared. She didn't need to ask what his presence meant. She already knew. The system was responding. It had seen the cracks she exposed, and now it was rallying its strongest pieces to push back. Whitaker wasn't just a judge. He was the system's last defense. Still, Jasmine held her ground. She had prepared for this. This fight was never going to be easy, but she had walked in ready to take on whatever it threw her way. As Whitaker settled into his chair, the courtroom seemed to shift again. The energy grew denser. People sat straighter, watched more carefully. This was no longer a routine proceeding. It had become something larger, a clash between one voice demanding accountability and the weight of an entire system resisting change. And in the center of it all, Jasmine stood without fear. As Judge Whitaker settled into his seat, the mood in the courtroom turned heavier, more severe. His reputation alone brought with it an invisible force, one of precision, control, and absolute authority. He hadn't uttered a single word, yet. His mere presence told the room that things had escalated. This wasn't just a courtroom hearing anymore. This was now a test of Jasmine Crockett's resolve against the full strength of the institution. Still, Jasmine remained poised. She stood firm, her eyes locked on Whitaker, not in defiance, but in clarity. She wasn't here to disrespect authority. She was here to make sure authority respected the law. And as she stood under the weight of both Monroe's resentment and Whitaker's looming presence, she didn't falter. The light above cast clean lines across her face, focused, confident, unwavering. Then, without speaking a word, she smiled. It wasn't smug, it wasn't rebellious. It was quiet, knowing, a subtle but unmistakable signal. I am ready. That single smile cut through the tension like a blade. It was enough to make people in the room sit up straighter to realize that Jasmine wasn't just enduring this moment, she was commanding it. Her calm demeanor sent a message. No threat, no title, no robe could shake her commitment to the truth. Monroe, still seated beside Whitaker, noticed the change. He couldn't understand how someone with no connections, no institutional power could stand like this, unafraid, even now. That smile didn't belong to someone intimidated by authority. It belonged to someone grounded in something far deeper, principle. Judge Whitaker observed her carefully. He didn't speak, but even he, the one expected to reinforce the court's authority, noticed something different in Jasmine. Her confidence wasn't performative. It was quiet, deliberate, not the kind that sought attention, but the kind that made people pause and reconsider. It was clear. Jasmine wasn't just another lawyer trying to prove a point. She was someone who had already decided that no matter how many powerful figures stood before her, she would not be moved. Not by intimidation, not by strategy, not by fear. Whitaker's gaze stayed locked on her, but his mind was working. He was seeing not just a lawyer making an argument, but a challenge to the very dynamics of courtroom power. Jasmine didn't need to raise her voice. Her presence spoke volumes. Her smile wasn't arrogance. It was strength. It was the proof that she understood what was happening, and that she was ready to meet it, not with outrage, but with composure. This wasn't about grand gestures. This was about unwavering resolve. And as everyone in the room watched, it became clear that Jasmine Crockett had just done something profound. With only a look, she had shifted the focus, from Monroe's posture to her position, from Whitaker's title to her stance, from institutional dominance to individual courage. She didn't just stand in the courtroom, she owned it. Jasmine wasted no time. The moment Judge Whitaker settled in, she took control of the courtroom once again, not by volume or force, but through precision. It was time for cross-examination, and the tension in the room thickened as she approached the witness stand. Everyone understood that this wasn't just another part of the trial, it was the turning point. She moved with purpose toward the witness, a law enforcement officer who had testified on behalf of the prosecution. Every step she took echoed through the room, marking the shift from defense to offense. There was no hesitation in her eyes, just focus. Standing in front of the officer, she looked him directly in the eye and asked a simple but pointed question. "Do you have any evidence to support your statement?" Her voice was steady, low, but it rang with strength. No theatrics, no unnecessary build-up, just direct confrontation. The officer faltered. His gaze dropped. The silence stretched for several seconds before he stammered out a reply. But it lacked certainty. He was unprepared. Jasmine pressed on, one question after another, each sharper than the last. "Do you have documentation? Photos? Any form of proof that the defendant committed the alleged act?" Her tone remained composed, but the force of her questioning was relentless. She left no room for vague answers, no space to escape scrutiny. The officer shifted in his seat, glancing toward the prosecution's table as if searching for backup. But no one moved. No one spoke. He tried to respond again, but his words came out scattered, weak. Finally, after another pause, he admitted it. He had no evidence. The room went still. You could almost hear the collective realization sweep through. The space. The state's key witness, the one meant to uphold the case, had no solid proof. And Jasmine, with her calm and strategic questioning, had exposed it all in a matter of minutes. The atmosphere shifted. Everyone, from opposing counsel to the jury, now looked at Jasmine differently. She wasn't just presenting a defense. She had taken control of the narrative. The balance of power had moved firmly to her side. Even Monroe and Whitaker, despite their authoritative postures, could feel it. This wasn't the courtroom they had commanded earlier. It had changed. Jasmine had reshaped it, not by shouting, not by demanding, but by revealing truth through methodical skill. She turned back to face them now, her face composed, her voice unshaken. No outbursts, no need for a final blow. She had already made her point. They had nothing. No foundation, no evidence, no legitimacy. The courtroom returned to silence, but it was no longer the silence of tension. It was the silence of realization. The case, the power, the performance. It was unraveling, and Jasmine was the one holding the thread. The courtroom remained frozen in that silence, the kind that settles in when undeniable truth has just been spoken. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her eyes locked on Judge Whitaker. She knew this was the critical moment, the point where all the arguments, evidence, and doubt would converge into one defining question. Across the aisle, there was nothing left. No photos, no reports, no credible testimony, only vague assumptions and scattered claims. Jasmine didn't need theatrics to show how empty the prosecution's case had become. She had already stripped it down to what it really was. Nothing but noise without proof. Then she delivered the question that pierced through the tension like lightning. Is the court planning to punish me based on feelings? It wasn't a dramatic statement. It was clean, deliberate, and devastating. Everyone in the room turned to look at her, then slowly to Judge Whittaker. The question wasn't just directed at him. It was directed at the entire structure that had let things reach this point. Could they really move forward without facts? Could they issue punishment without evidence? No one answered. No one moved. Jasmine continued, her tone calm and firm. I'm not standing here to argue over a difference of opinion. I'm standing here because I've been accused based on speculation, without a single piece of evidence to support it. Is this how justice is carried out now? Each word carried weight. She wasn't challenging the system with anger. She was confronting it with clarity. She was asking it to look in the mirror. And for the first time, the system had no reply. Judge Whittaker shifted slightly, and for a moment, hesitation flickered in his eyes. He didn't respond immediately. Jasmine had placed him in a position few dared to put him in. She had exposed not just flaws in the process, but flaws in the court's own foundation. The people in the room felt the shift. The atmosphere, no longer belonged to the judge or the prosecution. Jasmine had seized it, not with force but with undeniable truth. Her voice remained even, unshaken. If there is no evidence, no verified testimony, no record, what is left to decide this case other than personal bias? The courtroom stayed quiet. There was nothing more to say, and everyone knew it. Jasmine didn't ask for mercy. She asked for accountability. She didn't speak to gain sympathy. She spoke to reveal the core failure of the process unfolding before her. Her words demanded something rare in courtrooms filled with protocol and politics. Honesty. And as the silence deepened, it was clear that her words had landed exactly where they needed to. The truth had been spoken, and no one could unhear it. Jasmine Crockett remained calm, yet the energy in the room buzzed with tension. The questions she had posed didn't just challenge the case, they called out the entire process. And now, she turned the final piece of Monroe's own argument against him. She referenced the very legal statutes Monroe had used to justify his accusations. You referred to Section 12A, she said, her tone unwavering, but you left out Section 14B, which clearly requires that any charge be backed by verified evidence and testimony. Would you like me to read that aloud? The words were sharp, clean, and deliberate. Everyone listened. She wasn't attacking Monroe with insults or dramatic gestures. She was simply applying the law, his law, and she was doing it better than he ever expected. The courtroom leaned in. You also cited Section 22F to accuse me of dishonesty, she added, but without material evidence, that clause doesn't apply. You've cited empty regulations, with no foundation, so tell me, what do you have left? Just your opinion? A hush swept across the chamber. Monroe, once confident and composed, sat still. His eyes lowered for a moment, his lips tight. He had no immediate reply. Jasmine had not only dissected his logic, she had turned it back on him in front of everyone. She hadn't just neutralized his argument. She'd dismantled it from the inside out. Those in the courtroom exchanged looks, attorneys, clerks, even spectators. The case had transformed from a standard proceeding into something extraordinary. Jasmine had exposed how power could be misused even under the guise of procedure, and now everyone was starting to see it. Some lawyers in the room, once silent. Observers now nodded slightly. Discreet signs of respect. They weren't reacting to drama. They were acknowledging skill, strategy, and flawless legal precision. Even Whitaker, who had entered the courtroom to re-establish control, couldn't help but shift forward slightly. His expression softened, not in agreement, but in contemplation. He had witnessed something few ever did, a lawyer turning the institution's own rules into a mirror. Jasmine's tone never changed. She didn't need to build to a climax. Every word she spoke was already heavy with consequence. She hadn't only defended herself, she had proved that those who used power to silence truth would always face it again, no matter how high they sat. And Monroe? He sat there still, visibly unsettled. Not because Jasmine shouted, not because she humiliated him, but because she had taken every tool he thought was his and wielded them more effectively than he ever could. The courtroom sat still, caught in the echo of her final point. She had used the law not to argue her way out, but to expose a system that could no longer hide behind technicalities. For a moment, the courtroom felt suspended, every breath held, every thought focused on what Jasmine had just done. She hadn't simply won a legal point, she had peeled back the veneer of the system itself. What Monroe had treated as untouchable, she had rendered vulnerable. Judge Whitaker, who had remained composed throughout the trial, now leaned forward slightly. His once firm expression had changed. There was no visible judgment, just a measured contemplation. He didn't need to say anything. His body language alone made it clear. Jasmine had captured his attention. Even more telling was the quiet reaction of the public. Some in the gallery began to clap. Not loudly, not disruptively, but in that kind of restrained applause that acknowledged something powerful had just happened. They weren't cheering a victory. They were recognizing truth. Across the courtroom, lawyers known for their detachment began to nod in acknowledgement. Jasmine hadn't just argued well. She had displayed an unmatched level of command, dismantling not just the case against her but the faulty thinking that supported it. What she had achieved wasn't just a legal milestone, it was a moral stand, and they all recognized it. Monroe remained silent. The man who had once used that silence to dominate the courtroom now found it working against him. He had no rebuttal, nothing to offer that could undo the clarity Jasmine had delivered. He had been reduced from an untouchable figure to someone visibly trying to stay composed while knowing he had already lost control. Jasmine, meanwhile, stood quietly. She didn't gloat. She didn't react to the courtroom's shift in energy. Her victory wasn't about applause or validation. It was about principle. She had said what needed to be said, and that was enough. Monroe's silence was louder than any protest could have been, and it was the clearest sign that the courtroom, once firmly in his grasp, no longer belonged to him. Even Judge Whitaker, long regarded as a symbol of institutional authority, seemed to sense this shift. He looked not only at Jasmine but around the room, reading the expressions on the faces of those who had just witnessed the collapse of Monroe's argument. And he understood what many were now beginning to realize. This wasn't about one fine, one case, or one defendant. This was about a courtroom remembering what justice was supposed to look like. And Jasmine Crockett had reminded them all. The room sat still, every eye fixed on Monroe and Judge Whitaker. For a long time, Monroe had been the man no one questioned, the one whose authority seemed beyond reproach. But now, that air of invincibility had disappeared. His eyes, once filled with confidence, no longer carried the same weight. Jasmine Crockett had chipped away at the very foundation of his power, and now the courtroom waited to see how he would respond. It was Whitaker who first looked to Monroe, his gaze steady, asking without words, "What now?" And in that moment Monroe lowered his head. He took a breath, slow and heavy, and then faced Jasmine directly. "It's possible," he said, his voice lower than before, "that the correct procedures weren't fully followed. I admit, some steps may have been overlooked. The words didn't explode in the room. They dropped like a quiet tremor, sending shockwaves through everyone listening. Monroe, who had entered this trial as the system's enforcer, was now acknowledging fault. It wasn't just an admission. It was a shift. A crack in the wall he had built so carefully around his authority. Lawyers turned to each other, whispering, astonished. Some furrowed their brows. Others simply stared at Monroe, stunned by the change in tone. Even the court staff, typically unshaken by courtroom drama, couldn't hide their reaction. The acknowledgement wasn't only rare, it was unheard of from someone like Monroe. And Judge Whittaker, though still composed, couldn't ignore what had happened. The structure he'd been called in to protect was now publicly faltering. Monroe's statement wasn't just about one mistake. It exposed a much deeper flaw. That, for all his power, even he couldn't justify what had happened here. The case hadn't just changed course. It had turned on itself. And through it all, Jasmine stood quietly, her face calm. She didn't smirk. She didn't react with triumph. She simply stood in the truth, unwavering. She had come not to challenge authority blindly, but to make it answer to the law. And now, the same court that once tried to silence her was being forced to listen, to see what it had chosen to ignore. In that moment, Jasmine had already won, not just for herself, but for anyone who had ever stood alone against power and demanded to be heard. The silence in the courtroom was almost unbearable. Judge Whittaker, sitting at the helm of this tense trial, prepared to speak. All eyes were on him, yet it was Jasmine Crockett who held the room. She had never raised her voice. She had not demanded anything, but with each word she had reshaped the very nature of the hearing. Then she asked the final question, quiet, steady, and impossible to ignore. Is the court prepared to set a precedent that a person can be fined thousands of dollars based on mere words? Her tone wasn't confrontational, but it cut through the silence like a blade. The question struck not just Monroe and Whittaker, but everyone in the room. Lawyers, clerks, spectators, they all froze. Because in that one line, Jasmine had distilled everything that had gone wrong. Could a courtroom truly justify punishment with no evidence, no due process, no foundation, just the word of authority? Whittaker looked down at his notes, searching, perhaps for some form of answer, but there was none that could justify what had unfolded. Jasmine had reduced their case to its raw, flawed core. It wasn't just weak. It was built on assumption and emotion, and everyone knew it. No one dared to interrupt. Not the prosecution, not Monroe. Even the public sat silent, transfixed by the clarity of her question. There was nothing more to prove, nothing left to argue. The weight of her reasoning had already changed the atmosphere. Jasmine's stance was calm but firm. She didn't need to raise her voice. The truth she had laid bare did all the speaking for her. She wasn't just defending a case. She was exposing how easily the law could be misused when unchecked. Then the final blow came. Not from her lips, but from the opposing side. After a long pause, the prosecutor stood. His posture slumped. His voice, when it came, was subdued. "We don't have enough convincing evidence," he admitted. It was quiet, undramatic. But those few words shattered what remained of their case. The man who had come in believing this would be a routine win now had nothing left to defend. Monroe stood beside him, silent, eyes on the floor. There were no excuses, no counterclaims, just a quiet acceptance that it was over. Judge Whittaker gave a single nod. His voice was clear, final. "The sentence is invalid. Due to procedural violations and lack of evidence, all charges are dismissed." It echoed through the courtroom like a verdict on more than just one case. It was a judgment on a system that had tried to punish without cause. Jasmine stood without smiling, without gloating. She didn't need to. The strength of her argument, her discipline, her poise, that was her victory. She had come to defend truth and left having defended far more. News of the case spread quickly. Articles were written. Debates erupted. But more importantly, people who had been silenced for years began to speak up. Jasmine's quiet defiance had become a call to action, not just for lawyers, but for anyone who believed in fairness. She hadn't just won a legal fight, she had opened a path for justice to be restored, one case at a time. And long after the courtroom had emptied, her message remained. Justice is not power. Justice is proof. And no system, no matter how mighty, is immune from answering to it.